Hi, everyone, and welcome to the New Human Movement. I'm Michele Zanini. Gary Hamel and I are honored, truly honored, to be in conversation with Kwame Anthony Appiah, one of the world's leading moral philosopher. Anthony is a professor at New York University and the best-selling author of several books, including The Lies That Bind, Ethics of Identity, and The Honor Code. And he also writes the ethicist column for the New York Times Magazine, which I'm sure many of you have consulted over the years. And during his spare time, he also writes mystery novels. He's written 3 so far, and his family has a remarkable history. His mother was an English writer. One of his grandfathers was a Chancellor of the Exchequer in Britain, and his uncle was the 15th Emperor King of Asante in what is modern-day Ghana. And Kwame, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us, and welcome to the New Human Movement.
I'm delighted to be talking to you.
So let me add my welcome to Michele's, Anthony. Wonderful to have you here. And maybe just set a little bit of context for our listeners and our viewers. You may be wondering, why were we excited to engage with a moral philosopher? Well, those of you who followed some of our work, you know that we think that maybe we need a bit of a moral revolution in business. And we're not simply talking about paying more attention to stakeholders and the environment and so on, but particularly to people at work. If you go down through history, there have been systems at different points in times that worked far better for the few than the many. That was true of slavery, of patriarchy, of aristocracy. And we think in many ways it's true of our organizations today. And you see that reflected in some of the data we've shared with you at different times. The fact that the vast majority of employees don't believe their voice matters at work. The vast majority have little financial upside. They're not free to innovate and experiment. And they really are, in so many cases, simply treated as factors of production. We think this needs to change. We think everybody at work deserves dignity and opportunity and equity, and that's not only good for them, but it's going to unleash a lot of problem-solving capability that's just critical today, given all the challenges we face as a species. So we think there's that kind of, that deep system-level change that's going to be required to kind of flatten our organizations, to kind of maybe wring out some of that bureaucratic privilege, and to give so many people at work the chance to be their best selves. So we write about that in Humanocracy. We think that is something that's not just a practical matter of changing systems and structures, but to make this change, to really change the way we look at human beings at work, it's going to require something very deep, maybe akin to a moral revolution. We'll let you judge that by the time we're done to today's episode. But that's where we're going to start, and the idea that we have to challenge our fundamental beliefs about the rights, the abilities of people at work, particularly those who find themselves in what we wrongly sometimes called low-skilled jobs, which is kind of, again, our credentialist prejudice, assuming that the people in those jobs really can't make an extraordinary difference. So that's kind of the context. That's why we're talking to Anthony today, and we're glad you're part of this conversation. So, Michele, you take it away.
All right. Thanks, Gary. And so, Anthony, let's dive into the topic of moral evolutions, which Gary mentioned, and which is the subject of one of your books, the Honor Code. And we'd love to hear what you've learned as you were writing that book and researching it about how these revolutions happen. In other words, how do you go from a change in moral sentiments in individuals into a change of individual behavior, and then how do those individual behaviors change at scale so that an entire society is reshaped as a result of that? And I should say, before letting you kind of dive in, that the book is filled with lots of really interesting and deeply researched historical accounts of these kinds of transformations, including the abolition of slavery and the slave trade in the British Empire. So perhaps you could take one of those examples to illustrate the kind of the more general theory.
Good. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to. I think, and I'm on board with the general thrust of what you were saying about the kinds of change that I think we need in society, in business, but perhaps more widely. Let me just take you through as quickly as I can the case of the movement to end the slave trade in Britain, and that's a very interesting case for a number of reasons. First of all, the enslavement of Africans was a very important process in the development of the British Empire, but it didn't bring slaves to the United Kingdom. there were very, very few enslaved people in England, and by the middle of the 18th century, basically, if you got to England, your status as an enslaved person wouldn't have been recognised by the courts. So you basically could just march off, and as a matter of law. Now that didn't mean that was true in practice, because of course if your so-called master was powerful enough, he could enforce your rights extra legally, his so-called rights extra legally. But so here we have a great society which is dependent, whose economy is very much connected with the slave trade, because the slave trade is really essential to the growth of the Atlantic economy, and Britain, of course, owns much of the land in the New World as well as in the Old World, and many of the members of Parliament, for example, would have been owners of plantations in the West Indies. All right, so now, a very despised and minority, namely Quakers in England, start an anti-slavery movement in the middle of the 18th century. And they do it in dialogue, actually, with Americans, namely Americans in Philadelphia, other Quakers, who live in a place where there are slaves and who have a very different understanding of what slavery is because they've seen it. And they become convinced that you can't be a good Quaker and a slave holder. And so the first thing they do is urge other Quakers to stop if they have slaves from enslaving people, or from holding enslaved people. But what's interesting about the arguments they make is that they're mostly not new. Everybody knew that there were terrible things going on in the slave trade all along, and arguments against slavery start, at least in the time of Aristotle, there are arguments against slavery, and Aristotle favored slavery for the wrong kind of people, but other people made arguments against slavery. So everybody knew there were problems. So it isn't, and there's a mounting sort of level of arguments against slavery, and against enslavement, and against the slave trade, which was particularly horrendous because of the way people were packed below decks in the Middle Passage from Africa to the New World. I think that there are many things go on. This is driven by a rise in a new Christian self-understanding on the part of Quakers, then more generally among so-called Protestant evangelicals and so on. But I would like to focus on a little bit later in the process where something very important happens, which is for the first time in Britain, people who think of themselves as what the boss classes call the lower orders become involved in a mass movement against the slave trade. And as I say, these are people who've never met a slave mostly, and they don't profit from slavery. They're not aware of any economic connections between themselves and enslavement. So why do these people get so exercised about this? I think the answer is that something else is going on, which is the rise of workers' pride. Things called working men's associations are arising. And the thing they see in slavery, and the thing that finally motivates them against it, apart from, they're decent people, so some of them recognize the cruelty of it, but the thing that really moves them is the thought that slavery implies that the kind of people who do the kind of manual work we do are degraded people, because in the New World, in the slave colonies, they make that kind of work something that can only be done by degraded African-descended peoples. So it's an attack, in other words, it's on them, on their sense of self-worth. And I think that's one of the things that motivates the participation of working people in anti-slavery. And you see this a little bit later on in the 19th century when Frederick Douglass, the great American escaped slave and abolitionist, makes a tour of Britain, and he talks to working men's associations, and he gets a rapturous. They absolutely get it. They absolutely get what he's talking about. So,
well, can I just jump in there for a second, Anthony?
Sure, of course.
Just some context out of your book. You make this point that the group that was really lobbying and year after year going to Parliament and trying to ban the slave trade, they had fanned out across the UK, Britain, collecting petitions. And what I found very interesting, what I didn't realize, is that in many of these more working neighborhoods and in cities, like 80-90% of people were signing these petitions. There was, and what I hear you saying is, they didn't have any economic interest here, and they were not at risk of becoming slaves themselves. But they saw something in the plight of those other human beings that resonated with them. Something.
Yes, and I think, I mean, it's first middle class people who, I mean, these petitions are the first mass petitions to the British Parliament in the history of the British Parliament, which is an ancient institution, and they're huge, as you said. In some towns, but mostly they're signed by men, so half the population is ruled out for all kinds of complicated reasons. But many of them are signed by women as well. But huge percentages of the population in a place like Manchester or Birmingham, Liverpool, these big urban areas, are signing. And it's a sign of their sense. I mean, I just talked about the rise of working class self-consciousness, but this is middle class people saying, we're not just going to let the rulers in London decide what happens. This is our country too. We are a powerful city. Liverpool is one of the great maritime centres of the world. We're pushing money into the British economy. We deserve a voice too. And so at every level of society below the aristocracy, there are people who have a stake in identifying themselves with anti-slavery, and that gives them a sense of pride in what they're doing. And so the slogan, the great slogan, which Josiah Wedgwood, one of the great capitalists of the 18th century, developed, where he made these little badges you could wear with a picture of an African person like this, and it says, "Am I not a man and a brother?" You put that on and you say, I'm with the other people who have this on, and we together are doing something. And in answer to your question about what this teaches us about these moral revolutions, you need a sense that there is a movement, and a sense of commitment to the movement, and a set of relatively clearly articulated goals for the movement. It can't be too complicated. In the other cases that I considered, for example, the end of binding in China, you make two promises. I won't bind the feet of my daughter, and I won't let my son marry a woman whose feet are bound. Those are the two. That's all you commit yourself to. Of course, in the context of Chinese society, that's a huge set of commitments, but it's very straightforward. And once you get large numbers of, in that case, what we call mandarins, literati, into the movement, it spreads very fast. And again, I want to stress the point that arguments against the binding of the feet of children are already there. They start in the Song Dynasty. They start in what corresponds to the European Middle Ages. So what gets them to work, what gets them to operate, is the creation of a movement of people whose honor is invested in the movement to put it right. They're proud of their engagement with this, and they also think that the people who aren't engaged with it should be ashamed of themselves. They're a little bit in the business of shaming people, but mostly they're bound together by a sense of a common enterprise. And so it's very important to get the arguments lined up, because those are the things that sort of pull people into the movement. I'm not saying the arguments don't matter, even though they've been going on for a very long time. They're crucial. But what you've got to get that is combined with people who feel this is an important thing in my life. Being an abolitionist wasn't just a matter of subscribing to a doctrine. It was a matter of being a kind of person. Abolitionist movements in small towns in England went on for 8 hours. People listened for 8 hours to people talking about the evils of the slave trade. And they sat there. Now, they didn't have television to watch. They didn't have games to play on their computers. But nevertheless, this was a real movement. I think if the changes we want to see in business, which I'm down with those, are going to happen, we're going to have to persuade a lot of people to think of themselves as new. What's the name of your movement? Your idea?
We call it the New Human Movement, or humanocracy, if you like.
Okay, so I think you have to get people to think of themselves as joining the New Human Movement, and as thinking of themselves as being on the right side, which of course I agree about that, but some people may have to be persuaded, because there are going to be economistic types who say this is inefficient. You've got to make the arguments, but in the end, what's at the heart of this, as I say, is an identification with the correctness of this. But it has to be a collective thing. It needs that sense that we are doing something together, I think, which is at the heart of the sense of collective honor, the sense that motivates all kinds of collective activity. People die for the collective honor of their nations, for example, in warfare. But they have to think of it as a thing that it's a we. They need a we, and the we is the we that's doing this thing of creating a new kind of society, because ending enslavement in the Atlantic world inevitably, in the end, changed the British economy.
Can I ask Anthony, maybe to just try to unpack a little bit more the key success factors in the case of the evolution of the slave trade? Because as I hear you talk, I identify a few, and I'd love to get your reaction and maybe your additions. So first is, and it's almost the table stakes, you have to have a well-reasoned moral case, right, that is persuasive and so on. But that's, in a way, as you say, necessary but not sufficient. In addition to that, you need to make that case, really personal for the people that are exposed to it, or you're trying to convince. And here I'm reminded of Thomas Clarkson and the hard work he did. I think he went on horseback and covered more than thousands of miles, right? 30,000 miles, bringing the artifacts of slavery to people that would never have been exposed to it, or showing pictures of how enslaved Africans were kept on boats for very long trips across the Atlantic. So he made it salient in a way that just rhetoric wouldn't. So there's that, and then there's just the sheer organization, right, of creating these associations, creating these meetings, getting people to sign petitions, because it's not like they had the internet or mass media then. I mean, you mentioned that. I think in Manchester, in the book, 11,000 people out of 50,000 people signed a petition in 1787, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And then the 1833 petition was signed by almost, or maybe more than a fifth of British males over the age of 15. So these are like numbers that are like staggering. They're like tens of millions of people. That would be the equivalent in the US today. So can you maybe... So tell me if I'm wrong in terms of distilling those are the three ingredients, and then if you have any thoughts on, like, practically, how do they make this happen?
All the cases are complicated because in every one of these cases, other things are going on, of course. I mean, in China, one of the things that's going on is that they're discovering that they're not the most powerful country in the world. They're being beaten by the British in the Opium Wars. These people from a tiny island across the world who ruled by a 5'2" woman, Queen Victoria. How are they beating us here in China? Right. So they've got a lot of things to think about what's wrong with their own, why their society can't do what they wanted to do. And in that context, the sense that, well, these people must have got something right. And maybe when they talk to us about things like foot binding, we should listen because they're beating us. I mean, that's part of the story too. So there's another thing going on in the case of the slave trade, for example, which is that this is occurring in the context of the American Revolution, right? And the dialogue between Britain and the United States during the Revolution goes like this. We demand our freedom, America, Britain. What do you mean freedom? You're the ones with the slaves. And the American reply is, yeah, but you sold them to us, right? Well, if we stop selling them, you can't make that argument anymore. Now you're the bad guys. So I think there are a lot of things going on in every case. But, so various things. And as I said, another thing that's going on in the British abolition case is this rise of a regional sense that London isn't the heart and soul of everything, and that we, the great industrial cities of the North and the Midlands, are now important places. We need to speak out about something. This is something we can speak out about. It has a kind of moral clarity to it. I mean, once Clarkson has shown you what those conditions are like, you think, I'm supposed to be a Christian. That doesn't look like how a Christian society would treat anybody, any human being. And I'm proud of myself as a citizen of Liverpool or Birmingham or Manchester. So I'm going to speak up about this. So I think there's a lot of things going on. But yes, you've got to get a movement, and it has to be people who are engaged collectively in something, and they have signs to one another, right? They say, are you on the side of humanocracy? Yes. Then we can be pals. We can and we'll spend time with one another talking about things other than humanocracy, because we feel that we're engaged in a similar, in an important common enterprise. So I think that is a very big part of what needs to be done. And finally, I'd say, there's a lot of contingency because of the way these things get connected with one another. So here's the thing to avoid. What you're proposing sounds like something that, as it were, a Democrat would propose. But it's not, really. It has nothing intrinsically to do with the divide between the divides between Democrats and Republicans. It's very important, I think, not to let this turn into another of the shibboleths of the liberal tribe. Not because I think it's perfectly consistent with liberalism. Indeed, it might be thought to be an expression of it. But because in our context, getting enmeshed in those tribal wars between left and right is going to stop a lot of people who should want to join, because the idea, the sense in which the United States is liberal at the deepest level, in the old-fashioned sense of the word, is this is a country that people believe in dignity and freedom. On the right and on the left, people believe in dignity and freedom. And if you say to them, to be in favor of this is to be on the side of human dignity and freedom, and by the way, it has all these other productive benefits, they don't need to be left or right to feel, yeah, that's a thing we can do. So I think it is, so just again, once you tie things to the honor of one of the tribes, you've lost the other tribe. And so we should try to, in any effective social movement that can be disconnected from these things. Of course, some things are intrinsically partisan, but this isn't an intrinsically partisan issue, I don't think. Of course, the people who don't want change will try to turn it into one, because they'll know that they can get one half of the population on their side if they can make one of the teams have this as something that they're against.
That sounds like very wise advice of trying to keep things relatively depoliticized in a hyper politicized environment, and certainly we would argue that can be done in this case. But let me just go deeper on some of your examples, Anthony, because in our book together, Michele and I make an argument that if we really want to empower people at work, if we want to lift those people up, if we want to create these flatter, more meritocratic, open organizations, that this is going to take a long time. And I recently read a biography of William Wilberforce. I may have gotten this detail right, but I think he put this bill to outlaw the slave trade. I think he put that in front of Parliament like 18, 19, 20 years in a row before. So you gotta have the stomach for something that's going to take a while. But in our book, we make this argument, and not being deep students of these things as you are, we may have gotten this wrong. So, but our sense is that while there are these other contingent factors that are maybe nudging the world towards this new understanding, that the real argument that gets these things moving is not primarily a utilitarian argument, right? It's not like, well, we have mechanization now, so we don't need slaves. Or we need more brains in the workforce, so we have to make sure that women can participate freely. But it really does start out, as you say, with kind of a moral revolution, and it is that sense of like, this just can't stand, this is not right. That propels this thing along, even when you meet difficulty and when you don't succeed. There's this deeper sense, because you could argue, well, we want to treat people better at work because that adds to the top line, or, and we're not adverse to those arguments. We think those arguments are very, very powerful. We just have the sense that given how difficult this may be, if that is your only motive, you may run out of steam. I don't know. Does that accord with your experience?
I think that's right. That the sense that at the heart of it is something beyond prudence or interest, but that it has to do with a sense of moral purpose. And that means the way people get engaged with these things is they say, I don't want to be that kind of person. I don't want to be the kind of person who who runs a business that way, or who allows myself to be treated that way at work. I want to be. I have a picture of the proper moral relations between people. I mean, this is highfalutin philosopher's language, but people have these sentiments. They may not put them exactly in these sorts of words, but that's what they're thinking. They're thinking, I shouldn't allow myself to be treated like that, or I shouldn't want to treat people like that, and then it may turn out to be the case that what you're doing. I mean, look, in the case of foot binding, obviously unbinding the feet of women liberated them to participate in the economy. And that was part of what led to part of the many things that led to the massive growth of the Chinese economy at the end of the Qing dynasty. But no doubt. But that wasn't what anybody was thinking. They were thinking, it's terrible to do this thing. There's an old Chinese proverb which says, 2 tiny feet, 2 cisterns of tears, right? Do you want to be someone who's producing in 3-year-old girls cisterns of tears, wellheads full of salt water from the eyes of baby girls? No, you don't want to be that kind of person. And you want to be with people who don't. You want to be with people who don't want to be that kind of person. You want to be. And if it turns out that you can stop that happening, that gives your life a kind of meaning. I mean, your life has other sources of meaning, but this is one of the main sources of meaning in your life, I think, was abolition. For many people, abolition was part of the source of, it wasn't the only thing in their lives. And Wilberforce, for example, was massively involved as well in the campaign against dueling, which he also thought was immoral, correctly. And for him, it was tied up with his identity as an evangelical Christian, as someone who thought that Christianity was something you should bring into the world. It wasn't just something you did on Sundays or that you did at home, and it wasn't just a matter of prayer, it was a matter of social action, which hasn't always been how Christianity has operated. So I think we do, as I say, because of the contingencies, it's a bit hard to tell what it will be that will kind of pull people in. And in our kind of society, as you said, Michele, the thing about the abolition movement was that it was really the first mass movement. And how do you get that many people in a country without the internet and without telephones, and with most people not having even access to telegraphs? How do you do that? Well, there are these very devoted people who are riding around no cars, by the way. So they're riding around on horseback with this message, and they're organizing these vast meetings. I mean, vast in terms of the size of the populations of the towns and villages they're going to. And it's getting people engaged. So now, the trouble with the internet is it makes it easy to get large crowds of people, but it makes it easy to get large crowds of people for anything, including things that are completely worthless. And getting people to focus on a worthwhile thing is harder now, I think, because there are so many people trying to get you interested in various things. And that relates to an issue you raised, I think, which is how do we tell whether people are serious? Because that's one of the things that pulls people in, is a sense that they're joining a serious enterprise. And that's what makes them serious about it. We're social creatures. It's very hard to be serious about something except among other people who are serious about it. And so I think, organizing this as something that it could be, because of the very top-down nature of our current institutions, that you only need to persuade 50 really important business leaders to get evangelical about this, and then the message will percolate, because business leaders, people in businesses nowadays especially, follow the lead of business leaders, and if the business leaders say it's important, they'll think it's important.
Can I jump in on that point, Anthony? Because saying an issue is important is maybe different from acting upon that claim.
Absolutely.
Right? And because there's a subtle but I think important line and distinction between a quest for honor and for being worthy of respect, right? From just pursuing superficial respectability, for the
Yes.
sake of kind of short-term advantage. And so there, as you mentioned, there's been a lot of discussions, and some of it, quite welcome, around the fact that businesses need to think about their purpose, and they need to think about having a workforce where everybody is treated as a human being and taken care of in times of need, and where the composition of the workforce is roughly similar to the composition of the population in which that company operates. So those are all good things, but some have pointed out that some of these claims, especially by CEOs who are getting paid $50 million a year, sound a little bit hollow when the people working in the front line get paid 500 times less or more, right? And so, like, how would you think about what are the markers, or for figuring out whether an executive or a leader is really serious about this and is really trying to do the honorable thing as opposed to just doing the expedient thing?
Well, I want to say two things. One is this is a philosopher's distinction, but I hope it's helpful. There's a difference between the search for respectability and honor, because honor is about being worthy of respect. And there's an easy way to get respect without being honorable, right? Which is just to lie about what you're doing. So we have in the United States something called the Stolen Honor Act, where people get respected because they pretend that they have medals from wars. They pretend that they served the country, and that's now a crime. Well, those people were respected in their community, but they didn't deserve to be respected. And so the first measure of this is: does it look like this person is just wanting to be kowtowed to and wanted to be looked at as a great person, or are they genuinely motivated by the desire to do the right thing, even when nobody's looking? Because that's the key point, right? Or even when nobody can tell. So that the first thing I want to say is that that's the conceptual distinction. The concern for honor is not a concern for respectability. It's a concern to deserve respect, not to be respected. And that means you have to believe in the thing. You can't just know what other people care about and follow that. You have to. And one way you can tell is, as it were, by just pushing, just by asking, okay, so what does that mean? I mean, somebody who really cares about something, they're not going to just mutter the shibboleth. They're not going to just mutter the phrases. They're going to say, well, I've thought about that, and this is what it means in my company, and this is what we're going to do, and so on. So that's one thing, is there's a difference between just the search for respect. And the other thing to say is, however, which is sort of in the other direction, is, in a way, I don't care why they do it, as long as they do it. So if they do it because now it's respectable to do it, great. Maybe they're people who's... I'm not interested in whether they're going to get into heaven. I'm interested in whether they're going to change their businesses. If they are doing it out of a mere search for respect, they won't get into heaven. But they'll still do it. And one of the things that happens in these movements is that you create a kind of understanding that as it were, you'll only hang out with people who are doing the right thing, right? So your sort of whole social life and think about as it were the Metropolitan Opera fundraising dinners, right? Lots of people like this are there. If they feel that it's being known that they don't do this, we'll have people gossiping about them and looking down on them and asking to have them not be at their tables and so on. That'll be one of the things. It's not a very noble thing, but it's a thing and it works. So I think that when business associations declare norms, if they catch on, they're very effective because one community of business leaders is the company, but another community is the community of business leaders. And if those norms really change, and if people don't want to be hanging out with the people who are doing it wrong, it doesn't in the end matter for practical purposes why they're doing it. What matters is that the norm has shifted. Think about what's happened with cigarette smoking. A lot of us, it's not that there's anything deeply morally wrong with I mean, people make arguments about secondhand smoke, but those are exaggerated. We just don't want to be around smokers. Why is that? It's partly because we think that someone who is below a certain age anyway should know better, should know that it's very bad for you. And we don't want to be around people who don't know how to look after themselves in very basic ways, and so on. So that sort of thing means that now people who smoke kind of do it secretly, and they don't really like to be, at least in some circles. Now that's an example where honor of a rather trivial kind is keeping something in place. It's actually stopping some people from smoking or taking up smoking or continuing smoking. But it's because they care, in that case, probably not just about how they look, but because of thinking about that, they can see that actually the people who are looking down on them have a right to, because you're not looking after yourself if you smoke cigarettes. And you should look after yourself, right?
I hope you're enjoying the conversation, and there's a lot more to come. I just wanted to take a moment to thank Higher for supporting the work of the New Human Movement and underwriting the costs of producing this video. Our goal is to spur a revolution in leadership, organization, and work. And in that endeavor, Higher has been an extraordinarily reliable and inspiring partner. Now, back to our conversation. You talk about leaders as a community of leaders and kind of the imitation effect or the desire to be seen that, you're doing the right thing and you deserve to be part of this group. And I think that is a powerful impulse. I think certainly what we've seen in business over a long time is an enormous gap between the rhetoric that we use to talk about people at work and the reality. Many companies, you'll hear leaders say, people are our most important asset. Yes. But then there's almost nothing they do that seems to line up with that. For example, Michele and I were talking in another episode to John Ferriola, who is the CEO of the U.S. steel company Nucor. And they have, for the entire history of the company, they've never done a layoff. And they invest significantly in upgrading the skills of their workers. They give them when they say something, you can be quite sure it's true. And what I liked about what you said there, Anthony, was you have to push people. You have to test. Okay, I understand you believe this, but what does it mean? What are you doing? And I have a sense, and again, this is just a sense, and correct me if I'm wrong, but if you look at the stories that we've inherited from history of people who behaved in honorable ways, who've sought honor, almost all of those stories involve sacrifice, right? And they involve doing things that aren't in your immediate, perhaps, narrow self-interest. And so maybe one of the questions we need to ask is like, what are you willing to sacrifice for this? Or what are you willing to give up personally to make this happen? And if you get a blank stare back, then I'm not sure how much commitment is there.
Right, and in a society now where we have these incredible multiples of in the ratio of the income of the top brass to everybody else, especially to people at the bottom. Actually, asking people to sacrifice, at least in money terms, isn't really asking for very much. Halving your income if you're earning $50 million a year sounds a lot, but actually, most of what you're doing with most of that money is figuring out how to hide it from tax authorities or to spend it on things, or to manage it, or to pay people to manage it. You're racing. I mean, what's the point of? Well, I mean, we know what the point is, of course, and this is because of one of the bad connections between money and honor. That number is how people keep score. I remember Michael Milken said this about why he wanted to have the highest bonus on Wall Street. And he said, because it's how I keep score. He was just putting the money into foundation. He wasn't using it. It was just his way of keeping track of whether he was still the top guy in his business. I think we can convince people that they're tremendously good at what they're doing without doing it by giving them absurd amounts of money. So yes, I think that is and sacrifice. It's easy to sacrifice on behalf of other people. It's easy to say, well, all right, I'm willing to cut my shareholders' payments to shareholders or growth of share value. But so what? The real test, I think, as you say, is because if you feel that your honor is at stake, right, that's a precious thing to you. And the sign that it's precious.
What you're describing in so many ways, it's not only whether a society has an honor code, but it's what you honor and how perhaps you shift the currency of honor or you change that over time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's really why I find these examples so powerful. And again, I'd encourage anybody who's listening or watching today, get Anthony's book, read through that, understand how this happens. Let me just throw out one other thing, because you talked about the need to mobilize people, to have a movement, to put boots on the ground. But there's one other thing that seems to me, from my own personal experience, Anthony, that is critical here. And let me tell a very small story. So I've for a long time I believe that every human being has within them some creative impulse that is going to be used in some aspect of their life, redecorating a room or laying out a garden or whatever. So some years ago, this is at least 20 years ago, based on that premise, I talked to a CEO of quite a large US company into letting us train 30,000 employees to think like business innovators. And again, the prejudice is usually, well, innovation comes from R&D or product development, but like, really, Gary, you're going to train like blue-collar hourly employees how to see new businesses and so on. And we said, yeah, let's go try that. And I'll remember, Anthony, out of that, seeing dozens, hundreds of ideas come out of frontline employees. One in particular, I remember, it just happened to be an African-American woman who worked on an assembly line. And I can tell you, nobody in her career had ever before asked her, do you have an idea here? And she happened to have an idea that ended up being worth millions and millions of dollars. But what I took out of that was, my personal conviction about unleashing human capability to work, it was kind of this intellectual thing, this idea. It only became real to me and passionate to me when I saw it up close in a very personal way, right? Like Thomas Clarkson taking in the pictures of these terrible boats, taking in the thumb screws, the restraints, and putting them on a table and letting people look at them. And I just wonder if part of this thing, is figuring out how do you make the lives and the situations of these people that we take for granted and so on, how do you make that real in a way that kind of moves understanding from head to heart?
Well, what Clarkson did was a kind of act of imagination, and it engaged the imagination of the people that he took it to. But the first imaginative act was to think, how can I get this across? I would say that in these sorts of processes, it's good to talk to people whose business is imagination, novelists, poets, painters, musicians, because often the thing that gets you to see something is a moment. It could be a moment in fiction. I mean, it could be a moment in a television program where you suddenly see what somebody was talking about when they talked about the sort of the undignified way that so many people are treated. You see it in a moment, and you see the person going back home and with the sense of a wasted day, and being angry with their family or something. I mean, so I think there are sort of imagination workers whose job it is to help us see these things, and I would say one thing that one should do is try to find sort of work like that does its work, which is to as you say, to get to people's hearts. We've got to capture the minds, because the hearts unguided by minds are not much use to us, but minds unguided by hearts aren't any use either. So we've got to sort of get people at both levels, and honor's one of the tools. I mean, I should say there are people for whom there are people who are just motivated by their moral sense, which is a separate thing from wanting to be worthy of respect. It's just wanting to do the right thing, and that's also something. And that too, I think, is more easily done if you're supported by other people who think likewise. So all of this suggests that you need. It doesn't solve the problem that. I mean, one of the problems with all this talk about stakeholders and so on that's going on is that it, as you say, it's often talking about the right things, but it's also covering up things that people don't want to talk about. And I think the biggest. So let me just say, I mean, the biggest challenges, I think, to our whole sort of economic system now are basically challenges that Michael Young identified in his book on the meritocracy in the 1950s, and then went on to spend the rest of his life arguing about. They are, first, that we're not meritocratic. We're credentialocratic. But how you get the credentials is not at all meritocratic. It's just massively shaped by connections, parental income allowing you to get to better schools, and or prohibiting you from going to neighborhoods where the school's really good. All of these things are playing a huge role. And that's not merit. That's not what any decent person could possibly mean by merit. That's a problem we could do something about, though the will to do something about it requires people to be willing to sacrifice. They have to see that it's wrong. Because if you don't take advantage of the private school for your children, they won't do as well in the current system. And you, as Michael Young said, of course you should care for your children. It's not wrong to care for your children, but it's not wrong. But it is wrong to care for your children at the expense of your duties to everybody's children. So that's one problem. Yes, it's true that we give the jobs to the people with the credentials, but it's not true that the way they got the credentials was merit. I don't mean they didn't work hard. I mean that other people worked just as hard and didn't get them because they didn't have the connections or the background.
I should say, for our part, we're certainly not arguing that credentials are not important, right? I probably don't want to go to an uncredentialed physician. But I think what we are arguing, and of course we can't solve every problem in society, the problem of fair access to schools, good education, and so on. But what we do believe is that inside organizations, and what we see as a matter of experience and deep research, is that when you take, perhaps, not people who have great educational credentials, but when you take people in organizations and you give them the chance to innovate, you give them the tools. I mean, one of the powerful analogies for us, Anthony, is if you look what's happened over the last few years, as the tools of digital creation became next to free, right? And doing video, editing video, and so on. And as we created platforms for people to share these, where we didn't have the gatekeepers of the networks and so on, what you saw was this explosion of creativity with 30 million channels on YouTube. And so our sense is, and again, we see this in practice, is when you give people some simple tools, when you train them, when you treat them as real business owners, when you give them a stake on the upside, you see this immense growth of individuals. You see all the economic benefits, but you see them flourishing and so on. And so our sense is that beyond all the other things that society needs to do, business can do some immensely important things in creating a more meritocratic society and giving people the chance to grow and flourish. And that if people do not find that dignity and opportunity and equity at work, they may not find enough of it in the rest of their lives to make up the difference. So
yes, right. I mean, I think that's the thing. Everybody needs sociability, significance, income, shelter, access to healthcare, those sorts of things. A lot of jobs right now, a lot of new jobs, are terrible on the sociability and significance end of things. They're just awful. And to your point, if they were fantastically well rewarded, the people might think that it made up for that. But they aren't. They're also badly rewarded, and often for people who don't have very good access to healthcare. And so all the things that a decent job should do for you are not done for many people, and unfortunately for some people in what we might call nowadays the precariat, they're not getting any of them. And they can't even look forward to their children getting them, as some of them might have in the past. In Britain, something like if you take the precariat to be the bottom, whatever, 15% or something, their kids have a 1% chance of going to college or something like that. That's ridiculous. That just can't be, as you say, it just can't be true that only 1 in 100 people in that part of the income distribution is someone who could profit from a college education. It just couldn't possibly be true.
Or who could profit at work from the chance to have a bigger impact, to work on a bigger problem, to make a bigger contribution.
There's another problem here, though, which is another problem that Michael Young identified, which is that I think we can work to solve some of the things we're talking about now. It's hard, but I think we can do it. There's a very hard problem, though, which is whether we can build a society in which everybody gets read back to them the sense that they are a person of significance, that they are entitled to self-respect, that they have dignity. And that's particularly difficult to do in a society where there are massive differences in status and income. Now, we can make sure that status and income are distributed more fairly in the sense that people are given opportunities to compete for them and use their talents. That's all good. But we're not going to produce a society that allows everybody their self-respect unless we say and we believe that making good use of your human potential, whatever it is the task. And that if you do that well, you've lived well. And only a few of us are going to be presidents of corporations or countries or universities or whatever. And only a few of us are going to be, win Pulitzer Prizes, and only a few of us are going to be number 1 on the bestseller list. But everybody who writes a book that is their book, that expresses their thoughts, that draws on their work and their understanding, has done a good thing, right? Has done something worth doing. And I say this, and I suspect that a lot of people think, oh, he doesn't really believe that. But I do. And I think
can I just say a couple of quick things there, Anthony, because in your book, you quote John Locke, the famous Enlightenment thinker, writing in 1692. And I want to share, I'm just going to quote back to what you had there, John Locke's words. He said, contempt or a desire for respect, when you feel that contempt, it always brings uneasiness. In other words, it's always painful. And he says, for nobody can bear being slighted, right? So your emphasis on significance, I think, is such a powerful point. We may have quoted him before, but the founder of Southwest Airlines, Herb Kelleher, one of the things that he just said over and over again to his team at Southwest Airlines is, no job is more important than another job. I don't care if you're the pilot or you're a vice president or if you're loading bags. The airline doesn't work if we take any of this away. And there may be different pay rates and market rates, but that sense is everything here is significant. Everything is vital. And I think there's so many things in organizations that communicate another message. So thank you for just emphasizing that. Hugely important.
Of course. Yes. Yes. Let me just say, look, one of the things about this question about sincerity is the guys who are insincere should be told that people are perfectly capable of detecting BS. The question that you ask, which is, what are you willing to sacrifice for this? Everybody in the company knows whether the boss is sacrificing for this thing that he just said was very important or that she just said was very important. So you won't be. It doesn't build morale to declare things and then make it perfectly plain that you don't believe them because you don't act on them. In fact, it's bad for morale. And bullshit is not good for morale.
You mentioned meritocracy, and I know it's the topic of one of your more recent books. And we could have a whole other discussion on that. But I did wanted to just lay out at least a couple of things about that as we see them, because most organizations are bureaucratic, and Max Weber described bureaucracy as the ultimate way to ensure meritocracy, right? That where you're basically, people with the right capabilities get promoted over those who are less accomplished, and so on. But that kind of ideal that Weber described is like so far away from reality, and it's almost by design, because at least what we found, and I'll just quote one survey. We did a large-scale survey with Harvard Business Review, 10,000 people, and I think over 3/4 said that political behaviors are the most important driver of success and promotion. And in a way, when you're kind of creating such great stakes for progress and progression around promotion up a hierarchy, you're gonna get all human beings who being what they are, you're gonna get all sorts of pernicious effects, favoritism, political gamemanship inside of firms, people being, the people that get promoted being the most overconfident, and maybe not the most competent, and so on. So at least when we talk about meritocracy, which we think is still a worthwhile idea, just giving people the ability to have an impact irrespective of their particular background, you really have to think about the institutional design of these organizations and make them more egalitarian, as Gary mentioned. So not just having people say individuals are greatest assets, but shrinking pay differential, shrinking management layers, and so on. And then the other thing that a lot of these companies do is that they create multiple hierarchies of merit. So it's not just about getting promoted and having a zero-sum game for a very finite amount of status, but multiplying what people get recognized for, and realize that not everybody's going to be good at everything, and allowing people to express themselves and succeed in different ways, right? Because right now, most organizations, the only way you can be acknowledged for your success is promotion up the chain. And there are other ways to do it. There are companies that have like 2 layers of management and 40,000 people, and they find other ways for. So anyway, I just wanted to get your thoughts on whether, the way we organize our institutions could also help deal with some of the toxic effect of.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you want the organization to be organized in such a way that it does well whatever it is it's supposed to do, and it's rewarding for everybody inside the process to be contributing to that worthwhile end, right? And if you lose track of, you can't lose track of the first thing. You can't lose track of whatever it is you're trying, whatever it is the organization is supposed to be doing. You can't say, oh, we don't care about that. We just care about everybody being happy. But one way to make everybody happy while keeping an eye on the main, whatever the main agenda of the organization is by asking them for their ideas about how to achieve the agenda of the organization. Because people who are invested, there are many ways of investing. One is to put your money in, but another is to put in your time, your work, your sense of pride, of significance. And, universities are quite good at this. Universities are quite good at getting us to do things that they aren't in the labor contract, right? It's not in the labor contract that I should stick around on a Friday night to talk to the graduate students about things other than work. But it helps build the community, and it helps them learn how to do the thing. So we do it. And the people who do it I'm not actually particularly strong. I'm not boasting. I'm not actually myself particularly strong in this way. But I know who is in my department, and I respect them for that. And they know that they gain respect for that. And they're not doing it for the respect. They're doing it because they think it's important. But so there are many ways in which you get people in a university to do things beyond promotions and salary stuff, and we don't even use bonuses in universities. Maybe they do for presidents and people, but they don't for people like me, and I'm quite high up in the organizational hierarchy. So I do think that's, but and again, it's worth pointing out to people this thing that I guess it's Thomas Frank points out so often, that if what you're worried about is having the penthouse, you don't actually have to have $50 million a year, because if nobody has $50 million a year, then the penthouse will be cheaper. A lot of these a lot of this competition ignores the fact that the things people are after, rightly or wrongly, and often wrongly, are positional goods. So if you take 50% of the capital of the top 5,000 people, they will still be ranked in exactly the same order, and they'll probably all still be ranked above everybody else. But with that money, we can build roads, and then their Lamborghinis will travel more safely, and so on. So, I mean, that's an example of his. So I think that there's a sort of misunderstanding about the value of. There's a misunderstanding about money in this as well. People are using it to keep score, but that's not what money is for. Money isn't for keeping score. It's for lubricating exchanges of goods and services.
But I think what you're describing there, and what Michele was saying, if I can, is, we get to kind of define the game, right? We get to choose and set the game. And right now in many organizations, the game is you compete for the scarce resource of promotion, not necessarily to add value. That's sometimes just a lucky byproduct. But you compete for this resource of scarce promotion, which means managing up, learning how to deflect blame, grab resources, and because promotion brings the status of salary and so on. And I think what we're seeing in some of the organizations we're looking at is, as Michele is suggesting, there's still a hierarchy. Everybody knows, as you rightly say, Anthony, in the university, everybody knows, who's written more articles, who has more, more citations, and so on. But nobody's competing, or very few are competing for promotion. They're competing to make a difference, to add value. And a lot of, I think, what we think is, or a lot of our work is just saying, guys, it's not that the promotion scoreboard is necessarily bad, the money scoreboard is necessarily bad, but there's a lot of other scoreboards we can use that probably more closely align human ingenuity and effort with actually making a real difference in the world for all of our stakeholders than that game of ascending the bureaucratic ladder, which often seems to be, quite corrosive. And I think, I think that must be also part of moral revolutions, because in a sense, the moral revolution is resetting the scorecard for society in some way.
Yes, good. Yes, I think that's right. And that means that we have to, but I go back to the point about these successful movements, is that they tend to be focused on a relatively well-defined set of ways of doing that. And this is sad in a way, because one obvious thing to say about improving organizations is that actually you can improve an organization a lot by increasing lots of different things a little. You can make schools better by making 5% changes in 15 things. It's very hard to get a 45% improvement in one thing. But nevertheless, I think you have to focus on one or two things at a time. If at least to organize a movement. Of course, in your life, you can walk and chew gum. But
yeah, Anthony, I mean, a lot of the companies that we studied in the book that really are, operating on different principles than bureaucratic principles, all started with the premise that, the talent is distributed broadly across the population, and ordinary people can do extraordinary things if they're given the tools and the responsibility and the incentives to do so. And that human beings really do deserve better, right, than just being trapped in a 9-to-5 kind of dying. I think Studs Terkel called it, and so maybe trying to frame this as liberating freeing the human spirit at work, and as you say, and then making this really salient for people by personalizing the plight. The way Clark said, I mean, it's obviously not quite the right analogy. Slavery is so much more of a brutal institution than whatever people are confronting with in their work lives. But nonetheless, I think we can learn there. And then, as you say, get active, and maybe don't even pressure the elites. Hold them, push them, as you say. But then also get going, get organized, and because now you don't have to travel on horseback, right? You can you can get a big
yeah. But the thing you're doing that seems to me also an essential part of all these sorts of things is it's not enough just to see that something is wrong, and or even just to see what would be right. It's knowing how to do it, how to get there. I mean, for example, flattening the organization. If that turns out to be an important tool in this process, that's a point that can attach to the movement. The movement can say, look, other things being equal, flattening is good for the things that we in the movement care about. That's a piece of knowledge. I mean, if it's true, it's a piece of knowledge, right? And someone who might want to do these things but thinks that you have to have hierarchies end deep in order to do them, can learn that actually that isn't so, and that people feel better in these things. I mean, I know this from experience because I moved from a smallish private university to a very, very large private university just now, from Princeton to NYU. And at Princeton, I could just wander into the president's office anytime I wanted. Of course, I never did because I didn't need to because I was perfectly happy. But I knew I could. Now, I'm sure I could get to see my president, but not. He can't say I'll see anybody who needs to see me. He's got 50,000 undergraduates, and I don't know how many faculty, and he's got a huge hospital of people who work for NYU, and he's got a large law school and a big engineering school, and a nursing school and a dental school. He can't possibly say to everybody, anybody who likes can talk to the president. Well, it's nice. It was nice to be at a place where I felt I could just wander in and talk to the president, and I'm not complaining about NYU. I am very happy where I am, but it's a different kind of experience.
It may say that we do have to rethink how big our organizations get,
well, that's
or how they're, because you went back to you made this very important point about everybody deserves a sense of significance. Well, part of significance is I can talk to people I need to talk to. They'll take me seriously. My voice matters. And when you have so many layers and it's so big, that becomes very muted. I just want to thank you before letting Michele sign us off here. I want to thank you for your work, Anthony, and for your book. And most of all, what I took away from that, beyond all the brilliant scholarship and the stories, was there's a reason to be hopeful. There's a reason, even when you're confronted by things that seem deeply entrenched and backed by kind of powerful forces and precedent, there's a reason to be hopeful that you can change things. And it was inspiring, and it gives us a reason to keep going. And I hope so many of the folks who we engage with, who follow our work and who inspire us, I hope they'll also feel energized and inspired by that thought that there's a way to change the system. You can do it starting where you are. Perseverance, getting focused, building a coalition. This is what it takes. But there's no reason to sit and complain and be hopeless.
I agree.
Well, thank you so much, Anthony, for your time. You've been so generous, and I don't really have much to add to what Gary said. I just think that you gave us a spur to just get going and not wait for others to take the lead. So we'll take that to heart, and we look forward to staying in touch with you and follow your progress.
Thank you.